Installment of the Chinese Business History webinar here at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Hong Kong. I'm Ghassan Moazin. I'm an assistant professor here at the Institute and one of the co-conveners of our Chinese Business History cluster. So today we're very glad and happy and honored to welcome to the webinar series Professor Yujie from the University of Florida. Professor Li is a historian of 20th century China with a focus on labor, technology, and political economy in the socialist era. And she is assistant professor of humanities at the University of Florida, as I said, and received her PhD from the University of Chicago. She's currently working on a book manuscript called Foolish Man Moves the Mountains, Labor and Technology in Maoist China, which examines how the Chinese Communist Party struggled to support a modernizing and revolutionary agenda with peasants' muscle power and predominantly rural, pre-modern technologies. She has published widely in a range of journals, and her research has also been supported by the National Science Foundation and American Council of Learned Societies, among other grants. And today she will be talking about some of her ongoing research. Her talk is entitled Mule Carts in Beijing, Knowledge and Ignorance in Transportation Planning in the 1950s. The format of the talk will be as usual for these webinars. So Professor Li is going to talk for around 30 minutes, and then we'll have around 30 minutes for Q&A. If you have any questions for Professor Li at any time, please submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and then I will read them out for everyone during the Q&A period. But I don't want to take up any more time, so Professor Li, if you are ready, please feel free to get started.
Thank you, Ghassan. I'm very happy to be a presenter at the workshop. I have been a long-term, listener to many interesting papers presented in this workshop, and I'm glad to be presenting here today. And the paper I present today is based on a chapter of my dissertation, and currently I'm seeking to turn it into a standalone article. And this paper examines animal-powered transportation in Beijing in early and mid-1950s. And the problems I try to explore here involve first, how non-mechanized sectors were planned, and how much was the plan was based on the real economy. And the second, how did the government address problems particular to transportation development? And the focus or the thematic focus here is largely on one, capacity, and the other, let me just use a contemporary lingo, programming, but we can probably understand it as logistical rationalization, that including allocation of resources and figuring out priorities and optimize transportation routes and streamline schedules, things like this. And in the PRC transportation sector's own lingo, it is usually called rational flow. So I'm largely looking at these two parts, capacity and programming. And the presentation will be separated in three parts. The first part is an institutional history of Beijing Transportation Authority. Let me show you. So those three parts. The Beijing Transportation Authorities include two organizations. One is the Beijing Transportation Company, and the other is Beijing Bureau of Transportation Traffic Administration. Throughout the presentation, I will call it Beijing Transportation Bureau. I'll describe their years of effort to control the dispersed muscle-powered transportations of the city in order to establish state monopoly, fix the transportation cost, and make the transportation sector plannable. And the second part is a close examination of two plan documents. One is the annual plan for 1955, drafted by Beijing Transportation Bureau in 54. And the second document is the second 5-year plan, drafted in 1957. I'll discuss the discrepancy between the two documents and the incoherence within the second 5-year plan. And I will provide a hypothesis on these statistical failures. And this part concerns about the issue of capacity, and particularly how was transportation capacity understood and planned. And the third part is on the rational flow, on logistical rationalization. I will show how the state imposed an ultra-modern rationalization scheme onto the pre-modern technological environment, and how this scheme was undermined by institutional frictions caused by competition in controlling the dispersed animal power transportation resources. So let's first enter the institutional history. Throughout the years I examined here, early and mid 1950s, the Beijing authorities, transportation authorities' overriding concern was to stabilize price. This was particularly challenging in the first few years when the state-owned transportation company, Beijing Transportation Company, had to compete with other players in the market for the control over transportation means, particularly animal carts from surrounding rural areas that met most of the city's shipping needs. To achieve this control, officials believed that competition had to be minimized and ideally eliminated. So definitely they're not trying to solve the problem by achieving some kind of a supply-demand equilibrium, but try to eliminate competition. And this approach actually must be understood within the larger change of the time. In the early 1950s, actually, maybe more fair to say throughout the 1950s, Beijing witnessed its most massive wave of construction in centuries. So inner city transportation was largely devoted to construction materials. And because most horses, mules, donkeys, and the drivers of the animal carts came from the surrounding rural areas, and there is a timing conflict because construction was concentrated in summer and autumn, which was also the busy agricultural seasons. So this timing conflict caused constant shifts in the supply and demand ratio and led to volatile price fluctuations, which most of the clients, they were government offices and state-owned enterprises. That was all the constructions were devoted to. So these clients found difficult to manage the price fluctuation. So to stabilize transportation costs was the paramount agenda. And the Beijing government used both legal and administrative means for this purpose. So it first launched a very kind of a resolute attack on the old porter bosses, the so-called batou. These were local toughs who found patrons among the taxation officers or the police force of the nationalist government. So before the liberation, under their control, inner city transportation network resembled secret societies. So the boss demanded loyalty and tribute from the porters, and the porters depended on the boss for protection and income. The cracking down on the porter bosses began very soon after the liberation, and the government promptly sent the old battles to death row or prisons. Beijing then organized the city's porters and carters under Beijing Porters Company, which soon became the state-operated Beijing Transportation Company. And the company's tasks were much more challenging than simply replacing the battles, because the boom of urban development rapidly increased transportation volumes. And the transportation company was overwhelmed by an influx of rural horse carts. Since it was given the tasks to first unify I'm using their term, quote, unify the dispatch of transportation power, unquote, and unify the transportation cost, and later also added to this, unify the sources of goods. So the transportation companies' cadres scrambled to bring these carters under the unified management, which required these carters to accept only the BTC, the Beijing Transportation Company's, the BTC assigned jobs, and to follow BTC price schedules, and also submit 15% of their revenue to the company. So this was almost impossible when the private companies were still in the market and able to hire carters away. But following the 3 anti and 5 anti campaign, the state further restricted private business. Many private transshipping companies were forced out of the market, sometimes by imprisoning owners under vague legal terms. So the BTC, and on top of this, the BTC even replaced the Bureau of Taxation as Beijing's only legitimate issuer of transportation service invoice. In other words, if, say, Peking University wanted their transportation service to be invoiced, they had to hire carters through BTC. By the end of 1953, the company claimed to control 13,000 horse-drawn carts, about 85% of all freight-carrying horse carts in the city. So with greater control over the animal carts, the transportation authorities' attempt to unify transportation prices became more urgent with the beginning of the first 5-year plan. The Beijing Transportation Bureau was established in 1954. Together, the Bureau and the company worked to stabilize and unify the transportation price. The logic was that without transparent and stable transportation costs, the prices of transported goods would deviate from the plan and distort the plans of sectors needing shipping services. If transportation cost uncertainty entered every sectoral plan, then it would be impossible to converge on a national economic plan. So the Beijing government first experimented with unified price in brick transportation. As an essential construction material, bricks accounted for more than 20% of intracity freight transportation. The unified brick price regime involved strict top-down control of brick distribution. So it's not simply a price regulation, because the Beijing Finance and Economic Committee's Central Distribution Office will determine how many bricks to allocate to each construction project. The project then transfer a fee to the Transportation Bureau. The committee assigned the work to either Beijing Transportation Company if horse carts were appropriate, or to the Beijing Auto Transportation Company, and limited the fee. after the completion of shipping, the consignor and the carrier would settle accounts according to the vehicle used and the mileage traveled. So the committee, the Beijing Finance and Economic Committee, believed this regime would end the chaotic, self-interested competition among the consignors for nearby factories' products and for cheaper horse-drawn carts over more expensive automobiles. Complaints from individual consignors, for example, some were paying the unified price despite being located next to a brick factory, others waiting long after payment. So these complaints were deemed necessary sacrifices for the larger good. Although delayed service and settlement became rampant after the implementation, the committee extended the system to other major freight contents in 1954, including sand, gravels, and all these. And this shows that with economic planning in view, the authorities' fixation on stabilizing transportation cost led it to rationalize transportation from transportation sectors rather than the consignor's perspective. And then we can examine how the Beijing transportation authorities understood the capacity in their control and how to plan the transportation to meet the city's need. First, as a background, throughout the Maoist years, transportation was not a priority of state investment. During the first 5-year plan, the belief was especially strong that the transportation modernization could only follow industrial modernization. Although 15% of the first 5-year plan domestic investment went to transportation and postal service, nearly 70% of that was spent on railways. With limited investment in high-standard roads and automobiles, road transportation in the 1950s relied heavily on backward, muscle-powered technologies. And we can see this clearly in the Beijing municipality's second 5-year plan for transportation, compiled in early 1957 by Beijing Transportation Bureau. This document summarized the transportation development from 1952 to 1957, the first 5-year plan, and planned for 1958 to 1962. It covered both local transportation and long-distance transportation, freight and passenger alike, but my focus here is on the local freight transportation. This section of the local freight transportation section begins with first 5-year plan historical data, then analyzes problems, quote unquote, problems with the execution of first 5-year plan, and then presents the second 5-year plan with explanation of the principles and the empirical basis, as well as the challenges in making the plan. The document employs several statistical categories specific to transportation, including transportation volume, or the weight of transported goods in tons, circulation volume, which is the product of weight and haulage distance measured in ton kilometers, and transportation capacity, meaning the number of vehicles. The structure of these forms show that the development of freight transportation was understood through two factors: the modes of transportation and the different forms of ownership. Low technology vehicles and private ownership remained dominant during the first 5-year plan. Horse-drawn carts fulfilled nearly 60% of all transportation volume, and less than 2% of these carts belong to the state. The second table here, table 2, confirmed this point. From 1952 to 1957, animal-drawn carts fulfilled nearly 70% transportation volume and more than 60% circulation volume. Clearly, horse carts dominated freight transportation in the capital city. The document states that its first 5-year plan statistics drew on 2 sources. The first, quote, estimates based on surveys of the transportation volume in the entire city, 全市货运量的调查估算. And the second, quote, statistical records of various types of vehicles held by transportation work units, 运输部门掌握的各种运输工具运输的统计资料, unquote. So they sound as ambiguous in Chinese as in English. Still, combining these sources was necessary under the statistical methodology of the time. The Bureau used what historian Arnaud Gauche called exhaustive enumeration methods to collect data from grassroots units. Yet, since transportation work units did not control or had full knowledge of all transportation capacities in the city, enumeration could never be truly exhaustive. It therefore had to be supplemented by numbers from consignors who used most freight services, such as construction and general goods companies. The quality of data, therefore, depended on factors both inside and outside the transportation department. How well did officials know the vehicle records they supposedly held? Could their citywide surveys produce reliable figures? Did consignors themselves have good data? Did coordination between consignors and the transportation department allow for accurate communications? These questions lie beyond this paper, but they were crucial if the plan was to grow out of economic reality. But the document strongly suggests that planners' knowledge of animal-powered transportation was inadequate. In Table 3, which provides the transportation capacity of the entire city, the number of horse-drawn carts zigzagged dramatically throughout the years. By contrast, automobile statistics show close correspondence among transportation volume, circulation volume, and number of vehicles. Automobile growth broadly matched general transportation and circulation growth, indicating gradual investment in motor transportation. The changes in horse cart numbers, on the other hand, hardly fit their share of freights. So Table 1 and 2 tell a relatively neat story. Horse carts transportation volume steadily increased each year, while the circulation volume declined after 1954. This suggests that horse carts were increasingly used in shorter hauls, leaving longer distance freight to trucks, which was indeed the transportation department's goal. But Table 3 makes the picture puzzling. In 1955, when horse cart circulation volume reached 61,161 ton-kilometer, the number of carts dropped to 9,605, the lowest point in 5 years. A calculation of daily utilization per cart shows a significant 54% increase from 1954 to 55, followed by a return to normal the next year. Scenarios that could explain such a change, maybe carts were working day and night, or they remained in the city year-round, never returned to the countryside, or they added extra animal power to each cart. But these were unrealistic and absent from the records. The Bureau's freight plan for the next 5 years was straightforward. It projected annual transportation volume growth of 4.86%. This number was derived from the infrastructural construction plan, which was then based on the city's population growth plan. Given that Beijing's annual population growth rate during the first 5 years was 15.9%, this boded chronic logistical backlogs. One would expect this planned inadequacy, rooted in transportation's low investment priority, to be addressed by other means. Yet the second table proved otherwise. The table titled "The Number of Vehicles by Type at the End of Each Year During Second Five-Year Plan" shows only modest automobile growth and no increase no increase at all. A straight flat line from 1958 to 1962 in muscle-powered transportation. This flat line is not a plan, but a non-plan. Because a plan is intended to guide state investment. This simply meant there would be no state investment in animal and human-powered transportation. Since the modest investment in automobile could not possibly meet even the underestimated needs, the plan added more trailers, and double shifts for auto vehicles. When this still fell short, planners filled the gap with other vehicles, meaning vehicles recruited from non-transportation work units. In this way, social mobilization was not an auxiliary response to incidental failures, but integral to the plan itself. The plan embodied a rational approach to transportation management, yet it rested on a demographic projection that defied the visible trends and relied on ad hoc remedies. Though framed as scientific guidance for economic activity, it was full of uncertainties from the moment of drafting. To leave the animal-powered transportation in the plan, yet unplanned, was not simply due to the Bureau's negligence. In the National First Five-Year Plan, the plan of all plans, muscle-powered transportation was not tabulated at all. The section on transportation volume by major sectors projected increases in railway, steamship, automobile, and aircraft. Although no one believed that muscle-powered vehicles had ceased to matter, they were presumed certain to decline, therefore had no place in a plan where growth was measured through modern technologies. The blindness was rooted in the statistical work. The Statistical Workers' Handbook for Transportation and Postal Services divided transportation into railway, water shipping, road transportation, and aviation, but omitted muscle-powered transportation. Its road transportation chapter began with the concept of road mileage, defined as the length of all roads passable by automobiles. And all 16 items in that chapter were automobile-specific. It therefore offered no way to make statistical sense of muscle-powered transportation. The problem becomes clearer when the second five-year plan is read alongside the Bureau's 1955 annual plan, drafted in 1954. That plan focused mainly on automobile transportation, but its ability to plan for autos was weakened by poor estimates of animal-powered transport. It explained that auto transportation was tied to the reform of private horse carts, since Beijing was trying to persuade animal carts to return to the countryside or aid transportation elsewhere. The ratio between auto and animal transportation they planned might not hold. With this caveat, it then set targets for horse cart shipping and stated that their share of gross circulation volume should fall to 57% in 1955. So several issues follow. First, planners decided animal-powered transportation had to be reduced despite surging demand and insufficient motor vehicles. This goal reflected the desire to make the capital cleaner and more modern, even at the cost of smooth operations for the city's organizations and enterprises. Second, according to the second five-year plan drafted in 1957, horse carts fulfilled only 38.8% of total circulation volume in 1954 and 34.1 in 1955. If these numbers were accurate, then the 1954 annual plan's goal of reducing their share to 57% was meaningless. Since the annual plan was made earlier and closer to the years in question, it is more likely that the second five-year plan's historical data was fabricated. The Bureau used fictionalized data to fulfill and exceed the earlier objective of reducing animal-powered transportation. So statistics that therefore became prescriptive, reinforcing the plan rather than serving as an objective measure against which the plan's success or failure could be judged. So these documents show that Beijing did not plan to build enough capacity to meet its transportation needs. The gap between supply and demand was glaring and constantly growing throughout the 1950s, largely because officials tried to phase out animal-powered transportation before sufficient motor power existed. Now, we enter the third part about logistical rationalization. Rationalization was pretty much a central theme across production sectors in the mid-1950s, and transportation was no exception. To rationalize transportation meant to make it more economical. Any route, vehicle choice, or arrangement with a cheaper alternative should be replaced by that alternative. According to the National Statistical Bureau, there were four main categories of irrational transportation. The first was cross-hauling, 相向运输, which occurs when goods of same properties or same use value, that's interchangeable, are transported from different departing locations toward each other, and when their routes overlap entirely or partially. For example, if both Shijiazhuang and Nanjing produced apples, and Beijing and Shanghai consumed apples, the rational solution would be to ship Shijiazhuang apples to Beijing and Nanjing apples to Shanghai. Sending them in the reverse direction wasted transportation power, raised the cost, and increased prices. This logic made sense in theory, but it clashed with the complex material world, where goods from different places rarely had truly identical properties or use value. Planners recognized this, but treated a small adjustment in local demand as necessary sacrifice for the national interest of rationalization. The second type of irrational transportation was repetitive shipping, when goods go through unnecessary transfers, unloading and reloading. The third was overly long-distance transportation, either when goods took a longer route, when shorter ones being available, or when nearby goods were ignored in favor of distant supplies. And the fourth was irrational division of tasks among different transportation means, often shown in the preference for railways. Promoters of rationalization proudly claim that in a capitalist society, not only could transportation rationalization not be answered, the question itself could not even be raised, unquote. Given the fact that transportation rationalization was common in Western countries, what this statement reveals was the belief that rationalization was not to be judged from the point of view of the consignors or the shippers, but from the very top. This logic drove the creation of many rational flow graphs in the mid-1950s, dictating the transportation routes of specific commodities within defined regions. It first started with coal. Coal accounted for 1/3 of the national rail freight volume. A 1953 survey by the National Committee of Economic Planning found that irrational transportation of coal was extremely serious. Shanghai's coal came from as many as 14 mines, the furthest 2,000 kilometers away in the northeast. Cross-hauling was so excessive, Beijing acquired a significant coal from Kailuan mine to its east, and Tianjin received a similar shipment from Datong, west to Beijing. To a large extent, cross-country flows were unavoidable because mines, coal processors, and major coal consumers like steel mills concentrated in different macro regions at this moment. Also, even coal varied in types and quality and user-specific needs for high burning temperature or smokeless coals could not always be met by nearby products. The government understood these causes of irrationality, but believed centrally coordinated effort could reduce waste. Because high transportation costs really pushed the leaders to rationalize transportation even before any major geographical rearrangement of industry can be done. In July 1954, the State Council decided to implement coal zoning and rationalize coal transportation. It divided the country into 13 coal zones, each containing major coal mines and major users. In principle, coal mined in a zone would be consumed there rather than shipped elsewhere, preventing much cross-hauling and overly long-distance transportation. Within each zone, designated routes connected production and consumption sites. The graph makers hoped these routes would become simpler over time, ideally reaching one-for-one transportation in which a major coal user received all supply from a single origin. In early 1956, the zoning policy was extended to grain in order to reduce losses from long-distance shipping and address regional disparities in grain-to-population ratio. Also, much of the cross-country grain shipping was to meet certain dietary demands. People in wheat-growing region wanted rice, and people in rice-growing region wanted wheat products. Such unessential needs had become costly. The first objective of the rationalization of grain transportation was to resolutely reduce this exchange of grain types across zones. Without question, grain zoning had profoundly affected Chinese dietary pattern during the Mao era. Logistical rationalization was also implemented at regional and local levels, starting with construction materials. Hebei, Beijing, and Tianjin belong to the same mineral construction material zone, and they collaborated on making the rational flow graphs. These graphs minimized distance between origins and destinations. Places such as Chaoyangmen in Beijing, Shijiazhuang, and Tanggu were designated centers of inflow, while nearby areas served as providers. To prevent cross-hauling, no place was marked for outflow and inflow, implying that the local supply-demand relation was considered stable. This was plausible for large cities like Beijing and Tianjin, which always consumed more than they produced, and for rural and suburban brick-producing areas. But it became problematic for places in between. Well, Baoding, for example, was the largest city in Hebei and was historically a consumer city, but it was classified as a place of brick outflow. A slight construction surge could easily reverse this supply-demand balance. But the rational flow graph by nature had to exclude such contingencies. The graphs also did not show how the routes of rational flows corresponded to the jurisdiction of different transportation authorities. This became a thorny problem that obstructed the region's transportation, let alone rationalization. Initially conceptualized for centrally controlled materials and the railway system, the rational flow graphs poorly addressed the territoriality of road transportation under adjacent but competing authorities. The dispersed nature of rural horse-drawn carts allowed consignors and cart owners to strike deals behind the administration's back. This set up the animosity between Hebei and Beijing. The presence of Hebei Transportation Force in Beijing was officially sanctioned and justified by the city's seasonal shortage of transportation power. The Hebei Transportation Bureau maintained 2,000 to 4,000 carts on the ground to support the Beijing Transportation Company, but in reality had become its major competitor. Sometimes the BTC carts were lured away by Hebei, and at other times, BTC cadres, aided by Beijing police, threatened and disbanded small Hebei teams. The mutual resentment escalated into a feud precisely as the whole transportation system launched its rationalization program. Most of Beijing construction materials came from nearby Hebei counties, and Neither BTC or Hebei Transportation Bureau had exclusive rights over these routes. The neat lines and narrow arrows on the rational flow graph broke down amid territorial clashes between two parallel monopolizing organizations. In one incident, when the BTC sent trucks and horse carts to Lishui-Qiao to haul sand for Beijing consigners, including the construction team serving the state council, the local Hebei branch barricaded the road and forced more than 100 carts to unload. And fistfights and death threats ensued. Similar incidents happened all around Beijing, where Hebei Transportation Bureau blocked BTC's vehicles from reaching other Hebei suppliers. By 1955, the feud between the two companies reached absurdity. On February 6, People's Daily criticized both sides in an article titled, "Beijing and Hebei Transportation Departments Must Stop Their Hideous Competition," noting that even passenger transportation suffered. Buses between Beijing and Tangshan ran one-way empty because each company refused to sell tickets for the other in their stations. The paper condemned this as unprincipled competition and evidence of their localist, operationalist, capitalist mindsets. However, the disputes between the two companies continued to emerge in archives even after the People's Daily's intervention. In conclusion, this paper shows that the transportation in 1950s Beijing had both capacity issues and programming issues. The capacity issue was not simply one of insufficiency, but was rooted in the way that capacity was known, classified, and planned. Animal and human-powered transportation remained difficult to measure and even more difficult to incorporate into plans organized around motor vehicles. This gap between knowledge and ignorance was technological as much as administrative. Planners knew that animal-powered transport was indispensable, but treated it as backward, temporary, and destined to disappear. The rationalization program was conceptualized with total central control and modern infrastructure in mind. As a result, logistics were rationalized on paper, but remained fragile in practice. The state's commitment to transportation modernization thus produced a paradox. The more transportation was planned through the language of scientific rationality, the more it failed to respond to the technological and economic reality. Thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry for going over the time limit.
Yeah, thank you very much, Yujie. Thank you for this very interesting talk. As I mentioned in the beginning, so we have now some time for questions. If you have any questions for Professor Li, please submit them through the Q&A button in Zoom, and then I will read them out for everyone, and Professor Li can answer. While you're all typing, I suppose, I think I can probably get us started. One thing that struck me, that was more in sort of towards the beginning of your talk, was that it seemed to me that in transportation planning, uh, the sort of priority was given to how transportation was supposed to work, and not so much what the consigners and the shippers were thinking of how they would like transportation to work. And I wonder whether, from sort of taking that as a basis, whether you can talk a bit more about how socialist transformation of transportation impacted the larger economy or socialist transformation of the larger economy. Because I would think from the perspective of, let's say, the Beijing municipal government or the larger state, if I want to carry out socialist transformation, starting from transportation might be one very useful lever because that reaches into all sorts of different businesses and industries. And so, yeah, that would just be my question, whether you could maybe zoom out a bit and talk a bit more about what, the impact of what you described was for socialist transformation more broadly.
Thank you. That's a very good question. Uh, so, first, socialist transformation of transportation was mainly to turn the private companies in the city into public-private joint management. Um, so there were these porters company. They control they control the porters who may be just like carrying stuff or using human-powered carts, and there are a small amount of animal carts. And then other private companies had some automobiles, which certainly the socialist transformation of transportation, brought them into the control of Beijing Transportation Bureau. Um, that part was relatively, compared to the problem of the rural transportation power, it was relatively easy for the authority. So um, like once the transformation, socialist transformation is completed, the issue for them just became, oh, do we need to build some housing for the workers now has become kind of the state workers. And like which private companies was to be included in this, or which should be kind of downgraded and just kind of kicked out of the out of the market. Mainly, if a company was a brokerage, not owning any vehicles, they would be the first to be excluded from the post-transformation scheme. So instead of saying you're a private company working in transportation, so you will find a place in the in the socialist new enterprise. Rather, the brokers, the transshipping companies who didn't own any assets would be most commonly sued in court, citing like this is a violation of certain code, that if you don't own a vehicle, you're banned from participating in many different sorts of transportation. And usually they violate it because they need that business. So there are a lot of court cases dealing with these inner city transshipping companies. Um, the problem of the animal drawn carts is because, more than 90% of them came from the countryside. And that's not something socialist transformation could reform. The certainly cooperatives, collectivization, rural collectivization had an impact. But still, no matter it's owned by individual peasants or owned by a collective, they wanted to hire out the animal carts to the city to get some cash. So the countryside really had the imperative to seek out these type of employment, but at the same time, they don't want to be bound in the moment of like harvest or the autumn 秋耕, like on autumn plowing. So when animal labor was in desperate need. So the challenge came here is that the city also need these transportation means, but they cannot really control their come and go, and also they shouldn't try to negatively impact agricultural production, at least before the Great Leap Forward. So socialist transformation solved some problems, but not the major problem of this. More than half of the city's transportation relied on the animal power. Yeah.
Right, thank you. Still not seeing any questions. So as I said, if you have any questions, there's a Q&A box in Zoom, and you can just type your questions in there and submit them, and then I can read them out. Um, I
I
suppose,
have to apologize again for going over time.
no, that's all right. That's all right. That's no problem. Um, I suppose another obvious question is kind of, and it might be unfair because I think the paper is obviously focused on Beijing, but I'm wondering whether you have looked at all at sort of other locales as well, and whether you can see, differences or similarities. I'm sort of more thinking of the paper, I
Mm,
suppose. I
mhm,
mean, I think it's
mm,
obviously great to have the source base, but in Beijing, but yeah, I
mm,
think it's an
mm.
obvious question to ask, I suppose, maybe too obvious, but yeah. Yeah, whether you've looked at any other locations, other cities.
Yeah, actually, to be honest, I did not. Because this is when it was a dissertation chapter, the dissertation used to have a focus on transportation, and but I conceptualized transportation broadly, including like just moving things around in like a reservoir construction site. So, road transportation. I only looked at Beijing, and later I decided that this type of road transportation doesn't quite belong to my bigger project, so I take it out. And I think that's a very good idea, your suggestion that I should also look into other localities. Um, First of all, certainly the south and the north would be very different. I I believe in Shanghai would be a completely different scenario, like challenges that they face in planning their inner city transportation. So yeah, that would be something to look into. I think that's a good idea.
I'm just thinking in terms of, yeah, again, if yeah, I think that's just something people might ask. Again, I don't think there's a problem with focusing on Beijing in general. I think that's great, but yeah, that was just a thought, anyways.
Mm.
Oh yeah, we have a question. We have a question from Professor Shi Yuanxie, and she says, "Thank you, Yujie, for the interesting talk," which reminds me of. While you talk about transportation, you engage extensively with statistic and statistic collection in the talk. Your analysis of the statistics are excellent, but I wonder which direction you plan to focus on in the standalone article.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm also trying to figure that out. I For now I'm kind of thinking capacity and programming are both important uh, in thinking about transportation planning. Um, so I'm kind of borrowing the idea of nowadays, say for example AI, you know, uh, how much AI can do depends on the capacity, the data, and the programming. So I'm trying to think of transportation as similar things. You are trying to achieve, like optimize the exchange and the efficiency of the movement of things. Um, but despite that, this was the alleged goal. Many policies were put in place to kind of uh, impede the achievement of this goal. So I think I want to see both. The question is actually whether there are other dimensions more than capacity and programming. I'm trying to think. The paper is really going to be about uh, how the plan is based on uh, the technology of knowledge and mm, yeah, um, in the 1950s.
All right, thank you. Um, Yeah, I should say so maybe just one more comment on that. I do also think that what you talked about in terms of the Beijing Transportation Company, I don't know how many sources you have on that, but that would also be an interesting angle. I think depending on how you want to develop the paper in the end.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the Beijing Transportation Company did really had a lot materials. But for personally, I found the discussion on irrational transportation to be most interesting.
Mhm.
Um, and the particularly fascinating part that, this talk, I didn't have time to go into it, is I kind of also was fascinated by their work style, because transportation cadres they had a kind of work style that's typical of um, actually, the people they try to strike down the bateau, the old porter bosses. They pretty much inherited that type of work style. Um, well, but you at the same time you are relying on this group of people who's not particularly conversant in in administration, in statistics, yet they have to come up with some kind of plan that looks systematic. So this gap between their capability and the task given them is also, I think, an interesting aspect of the story.
That's interesting as well. That's true. Um, it looks like that we don't have any further questions, and I'm looking at the time as well. We are basically already at time.
Yeah,
So I think what remains for me to do, Professor Lee, is to thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us and to present your work. And I think we're all looking forward to seeing it in print somewhere, for sure. And well, I'm sure it will find a very good home. But we're all looking forward to that.
thank you. Thank
I'm
you,
sure.
Jim.
Yeah.
Thank
Uh,
you. And thank
well,
you for
yeah.
listening to my talk. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, and thanks for everyone to everyone for tuning in as well. So thank you, everyone.
Right. Bye.
Bye.